Here's a debate Alex O'Connor had with Dinesh D'Souza where Dinesh loses embarrassingly.
Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. I'm told sometimes that this is actually an exercise in hyperbole. God didn't mean everyone. It continues, do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys.
What did the cattle and the sheep do? It's bad enough that the infants and toddlers were made targets. Sometimes I hear the rebuttal that they would have grown up to be evil or something, but you can't use that excuse for the sheep and the donkeys. They were not a threat and could never have become a threat.
And if you think that this is hyperbole, consider what happens when Saul does conduct the destruction of the Amalekites as ordered and decides to leave alive the king as well as some of the best of the livestock. He leaves them alive. For this small act of mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions.
Why would an infallible God have regrets? Wouldn't God also be omniscient enough to know what Saul would do ahead of time? How does it make any sense to regret taking an action that had the result that you knew for certain it would have?
So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing?
William Lane Craig's response was to admit that he does not in fact believe that unaliving innocent children per se is wrong. It's only wrong if you do it without God's permission.
Let's talk about the moral sense, since you raised it, and we'll just talk about it briefly.
I want to make sure we've got time for Q&A, but look, I can reread the text if you like. The Amalekites...
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New.
Dinesh seems to want to expound a kind of quasi-Marcionism. Marcionism was a very early interpretation of Christianity that said that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are two different gods. Most Christians today, of course, believe this to be heresy. Dinesh isn't quite saying that, but he seems to believe that the God described by the Bible has evolved or changed somehow. At the very least, he's changed how he interacts with the world. The idea that God can change also seems like it would be theologically controversial.
So,
but
if you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites.
Sure, we can bring him out
what he
later,
considers to be the justifiable master of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there.
Is that because you don't agree with Dennis Prager?
Because...
Well, I know why you don't want to go there.
Well, the reason I don't want to go there, the Old Testament is full of horrific matters.
Yes, and
that is, hold on.
Matters which are ordained.
Matters which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly. Sure. Agreed. And
why are you saying Yahweh instead of God? Why are you trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament?
I think it's because Dinesh is a closet Marcionist. Also, why does Dinesh give the hedge that they appear to be ordained by God? Does he suspect that the Israelites were mistaken to believe that this is what God wanted?
Well, I'm not trying to distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader...
So why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh in this conversation?
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within the Bible itself that you are completely missing.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Yeah, so the idea that the morality of the Old Testament is different from the morality of the New Testament is hard to square with Jesus' insistence that he intends to preserve all the old rules and commandments.
The underlying message of the Old Testament is an eye for an eye. The Amalekites are the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites will crush them with the same venom that the Amalekites would have crushed the Israelites. That's called an eye for an eye.
That's not an eye for an eye. That's an eye for what hypothetically would have been an eye. An eye for an eye would be if the Amalekites had attacked the Israelites first and the Israelites responded in kind. What Dinesh seems to be proposing is that the Amalekites were preemptively punished for a pre-crime. However, even if this were a theologically sound interpretation, how does it explain the slaughter of the animals? Not only did the sheep not attack the Israelites, they were never going to attack the Israelites, so what's the point of punishing them?
Including
now,
the children,
hold on.
The children, the infants,
the children,
the cattle,
infants,
the sheep, the camels, the donkeys.
Yeah, that Dennis Prager says yes, but my point is different. You will not find that spirit at all in the New Testament.
So God changed then? Is that what Christians believe? Dinesh is sounding like Marcion the heretic again.
In fact, in the New Testament, you've got a spirit of forgiveness. So what I'm getting at is to pretend like you don't have this. I mean, Christianity is named after Christ. It's based on Christ as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But what does fulfillment mean? It actually means transcendence.
How does fulfillment mean transcendence? And what transcended exactly? Did God transcend? Did humanity transcend? What specifically changed to make it no longer necessary for God to order the mass unaliving of entire ethnic groups?
In Abraham's time, blood sacrifices are normal. Right? When Christ comes as a sacrifice, Christ is the lamb. The point is, those blood sacrifices aren't necessary anymore.
So was the attack on the Amalekites an eye for an eye, or was it a blood sacrifice? Those are different things.
Listen, That's the Christian reading. And you keep filibustering me because you know that the Bible is showing a movement in a direction, and to miss the movement is to miss the Bible. Let's look at God in the Bible.
Hold on.
Let me make one quick point about God in the Bible.
There's nothing quick about what you're doing, Dinesh. There's nothing quick about what you're doing. I need to be allowed to respond to what you're saying. I am getting sick whenever I have these conversations.
You're cross-examining me on the justice of smiting the Amalekites. Honestly, I don't see any justice in it, but I do agree that was the eye for an eye ethic of the Old Testament that is repudiated and transformed and transfigured in the New.
So God repudiates his own system of justice?
I've had this conversation so many times, most recently with William Lane Craig. At least he had the gall to just tell me that, yes, that was a moral thing for God to do. I get sick to death of people hand-waving away this genocide by some vague reference to the fact that Jesus came along to do something which somehow kind of undoes the immorality of it. Like, this is not an eye for an eye. This is a genocide of combatant men, innocent women, and children, and animals. Saul is punished by God for not killing all of the animals.
Yeah, what does that have to do with an eye for an eye? That doesn't even make sense in Dinesh's interpretation that an eye for an eye applies to hypothetical pre-crimes.
All right. We might have some time.
Christianity invented the just war tradition, according to which the slaughter of women and children is out of bounds.
That would have been news to the Crusaders, who did that not only to their enemies, but also to their own people on their way to the battlefield. When Pope Urban II told Peter the Hermit to go to Jerusalem, he and his army killed thousands of fellow Christian civilians on the way there, often just to get supplies. That's worse than an eye for an eye. If Christians invented the principle that this isn't okay, then why do Christian militaries do it just as often as any other?
Prior to Christianity, no one thought this.
How could you possibly know that to be the case? And well after the advent of Christianity, many Christians still failed to think this. It seems, therefore, that Christianity per se didn't really have anything to do with the idea that children ought not be targeted in armed conflict.
Everybody did it, and everybody today does it everywhere in the world, and we do it too.
You're not making a great case for this being a Christian idea if you admit that Christians continue to defy this principle.
So, what I'm getting at is
that everybody does it.
It is not ethical, it is not, but I'm simply saying, Alex, that you are a product of the Christian morality that repudiates it now. You're standing on a Christian mountain and acting like, whoa, look at these Christians.
How is it that Christianity repudiates the orders of the pre-Christian God if that God is the same one that Christians worship?
They taught you to talk like this.
These people did not teach me to think like that.
They did.
These people were listening to their God who was telling them to slaughter innocent women and
children.
That's
right. The ancient Israelites were. But the ancient Israelites are not what taught you. What taught you is the 1,000-year tradition of the early Christian church.
Which came a bit too late for the Amalekites.
It came a bit too late for the Amalekites, to be sure.
That brings up another question. Why did it take so long for God to change, if that is indeed what happened? Why didn't Jesus show up to die for everyone's sins immediately after Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden? Why were there millennia of smiting and mass unaliving before that happened?
The Israelite army is not instructed by the God that you believe in.
They were instructed by God.
And they were instructed to do things which you would now consider to be immoral, yes?
Absolutely.
So God has commanded them to do something which you now consider to be immoral, whether or not you consider it to be immoral because of the later developments of Christian ethics. God himself has told us that we must abandon our intuition that the slaughter of women and children, and by the way, when it's unnecessary in those instances to slaughter them, is wrong.
I don't view it that way. This is how I view it. Let's put it this way. Even in the ancient world, divine revelation comes into a primitive, barbaric world, which is full of a lot of really bad guys.
And God says, keep going.
No,
God
does not say keep going.
So after Jesus arrived, there weren't as many really bad guys? The really bad guys were so few in number afterwards that these kinds of missions were no longer necessary? Is that it?
But what God does is and again, this is called, trying to get the point of what is happening. There's slavery in this world, in the ancient world.
That God also endorsed.
And it is true. The Bible doesn't come in and go, we denounce slavery. We denounce the killing of women and children. It doesn't do that.
The opposite.
It actually immerses itself into an existing, admittedly barbaric culture.
How does that make wiping out whole ethnic groups okay?
And what's actually going on there with the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and so on, if you just read the Old Testament, it tells you. It has to do with the displacement of polytheism with monotheism.
Where in the Old Testament does it say that? The religion of the Israelites was not monotheistic. The whole reason the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me," is because they believed there were, in fact, other gods. And this commandment instructs the Israelites not to prioritize them above the God giving that commandment. Some apologists will say that this doesn't really count as polytheism because they only worshipped one God. But I think that's a no true Scotsman argument because the common understanding of polytheism is not just the worship of multiple gods, but rather simply the belief in multiple gods.
That's fine.
Hold on.
That justifies the murder of children and women.
I didn't say it does.
That's what you're implying.
I'm saying
Otherwise
that the way it happens historically is God takes a side. The single monotheistic God, who, by the way, in the Old Testament does not act like a monotheistic God. He acts like a tribal God.
That's because he was one and was not a monotheistic God. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.